hate this. We got this. Good afternoon, committee members. The clerk has advised me we have a quorum and everybody is appearing in person, witnesses as well as committee members this afternoon. So I will call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 106 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members have the option of appearing virtually or in the room. To those, and as indicated today, everybody's appearing in person in the room. So to advise, you have the option of choosing to speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available by using the earpiece and translation on the in front of you. I would also advise you that keep your earpiece away from the mic to protect the interpreters, because you can get the pinging if it's too close. If there is a loss of translation services, please get my attention by raising your hand. We'll suspend while it is being clarified. As I would remind members, all comments must be addressed through I, the chair. And yes, as I indicated, to do that, simply raise your hand. There's nobody appearing virtually. Raise your hand in the room and to get my attention, and I will recognize you. This afternoon, or pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, October 18, 2023, the committee is continuing its study on Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board Regulations 2012. For today's meeting, I must advise that we'll be hearing from representatives of two organizations at their request. The third organization was invited to appear, but asked to be rescheduled to a later meeting in April. So at that meeting, we'll have four organizations on the panel. So today, and it was at their request, and I did agree to that. From the Canadian Labour Congress, B. Bresk, President, Chris Roberts, Director, Social and Economic Policy Department, and from the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Ryan Greer, Vice President, Public Affairs and National Policy. Each group will have 5 minutes or less for an opening statement. We'll begin with Madame Bresk, President. Madame, pour 5 minutes.
Madame, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Canadian Labour Congress is Canada's largest central labour body. We represent over 55 different unions and over 3 million workers in every sector and in every industry from coast to coast to coast. The CLC strongly supports Bill C-58 and urges the committee to strengthen the bill and to report the bill back to the House for third reading as quickly as possible. In my over 30 years as a union activist, I've walked on countless picket lines in every part of this country. I've walked in the heat, the cold, the rain, in the middle of the night with workers right across this country. I've walked with them on day 1, and I've walked with them on day 123 of their strike or lockout. And let's be clear, the decision to walk a picket line is never an easy decision for a worker to make. These are kitchen table conversations that workers have with their families. Can I afford the meager offer that the employer is putting forward? Or worse, can I afford the takeaways that the employer has tabled in their concessions that they are demanding from me? Or am I prepared to forego a paycheck and risk absolutely everything that I've built up with this employer in order to demand a fair deal by walking a picket line? No worker wants to walk a picket line. What they want is a fair deal that's reached at a bargaining table with good conversations happening between the parties. And let's be clear, at times it's not the worker's choice whether or not to be walking a picket line, but rather the employer who chooses to lock out workers and then rubs salt in the wound by hiring scab labor. That employer is sending workers one message, and it's, if you want to see your jobs and your wages again, you had better back down and accept the offer that we are putting forward. When employers have scabs in their back pocket, they don't need to come to the table to bargain fairly. They don't need to be serious about reaching a collective agreement. And yet workers, on the other hand, risk absolutely everything when they walk that picket line because, let's be honest here, some employers don't ever intend on getting to a fair collective agreement. They use a lockout or they push workers into a strike position by tabling massive concessions or to try to get rid of union representation in their workplace. My co-worker from many years ago, Judy Starr, worked at Loblaw for many years when our very financially sound employer demanded a reduction to our wages and benefits way back in 1987. Judy was a single parent with 3 kids living in social housing, and she knew that by walking a picket line, it meant no regular paycheck for weeks to come. And she also knew that not walking that picket line would mean an even harder time for her family to try to make ends meet. She rallied her co-workers, myself included, to take on the employer's demands for concession by walking that picket line. And our employer repaid workers like Judy by replacing her with scabs on day number 1. The use of scabs in that strike meant that that strike dragged on for 124 days. 124 days of those workers having no paycheck while the employer continued doing business as usual, and their workers who had diligently worked for them were made to walk a picket line just to keep what we had, not to make gains in that contract, to keep what we had. Once the strike started, it was very clear that this was more than just a dispute about reaching a new collective agreement. It was about the very right about these workers being able to have a voice at our workplace and to continue to be represented by a union. For decades, the CLC has urged government to pass anti-scab legislation, and I want to commend the NDP and the Liberal government for working together to finally making this a reality. We have seen that this bill has unanimous support, and there is no excuse for delaying and adopting and bringing this legislation into force. 18 months is unnecessarily long and far too long to be bringing this bill into effect. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Madame Brusque. Mr. Greer, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members, for having me here today on behalf of the Canadian manufacturers and exporters. Manufacturing generates 10% of Canada's GDP, produces nearly 2/3 of Canada's value-added exports, and employs 1.8 million people in high-paying jobs across the country. It is important that the views of manufacturers are reflected in your deliberations and decisions regarding Bill C-58. Up front, I want to note that my remarks will be focused on how this bill will impact manufacturers' reliance on railways and ports, critical enablers of Canada's industrial economy. Their importance, of course, extends beyond the manufacturing sector. Ports and railways are the tangible connections that facilitate the functioning of our economy and the well-being of Canadians. CME opposes C-58. Many of our concerns with banning replacement workers in federally regulated industries are the same concerns that have been expressed by Parliament over the last decade and a half when it has voted against several similar initiatives. Banning replacement workers in federally regulated industries may disrupt the delicate balance that exists in Canada's collective bargaining system. The government's own discussion paper on this legislation stated that most studies on prohibiting replacement workers showed that they resulted in more strikes and lockouts. More labor disruptions will negatively impact small, medium, and large manufacturers that rely on Canada's railways and ports to access critical inputs and get their goods to Canadian consumers and global markets. Collective bargaining is an important part of a fair and functioning economy. However, there is a fundamental difference between a work stoppage at a port or railway and most other public or private organizations. The interconnected nature of modern manufacturing and logistics means that disruptions in these parts of the supply chain reverberates through the entire economy. It is essential that supply chains continue to function even during times of collective bargaining. When labor action stops the movement of goods, it imposes harm on manufacturers and their communities that are often hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. This is neither fair nor functioning. It is imperative that the well-being of those businesses, their workers, and their families are also taken into account in your study of this bill. While CME does not support the legislation, we appreciate the opportunity to participate in your work in the hope that this committee will adopt amendments to the bill that will minimize its harm to manufacturers, the broader economy, and Canada's reputation as a reliable trading partner. CME recommends that this bill include a provision that grants authority to the Governor and Council to refer labor disputes in critical supply chain sectors to binding arbitration if parties cannot reach a negotiated settlement or negotiated agreement through collective bargaining. Given the likelihood that the legislation will increase supply chain disruptions, it is appropriate to provide the federal government the tools necessary to facilitate a resolution to disputes when they harm the national interest. Additionally, we believe there are other amendments that could be made to the bill to further minimize supply chain uncertainty. We recommend that Section 9(7) of the legislation be expanded to allow an employer to use a prohibited worker when there is an imminent or serious threat to the national interest or national economic security. We also recommend that Section 87(4) of the Canada Labour Code be expanded to prevent imminent harm to the national interest or national economic security. Again, our preference is that the legislation does not proceed. However, given the likelihood that it will, we urge you to seriously consider amendments that will support the integrity and resilience of Canadian supply chains. Last fall, Minister O'Regan announced a review process under Section 106 of the Canada Labour Code to examine the structural issues underlying the recent longshoring dispute at our West Coast ports, as well as some similar disputes. He had this to say at that time: Canada is a reliable trading partner to the world. That is a good thing for every employer and every worker in this country. But our credibility depends on the stable operation of our supply chains. We must do everything we can to preserve that stability. It is in that spirit that CME is asking this committee to take steps to help preserve Canada's supply chain credibility and stability. Canadian manufacturers are depending on it. Thanks for having us here, and I look forward to your questions.
Merci, Monsieur Guerrier. Bienvenue, Monsieur
Thank you,
Bullen.
Mr. Gear. Welcome to two people who just joined us. We'll begin with Ms. Gray for 6 minutes.
Just before we begin, I didn't want to interrupt the witnesses, but there's an interpretation problem again. We've got this echoing, and so I don't know if that's going to continue the whole meeting. I know that in the past, if they couldn't resolve that, it appears that the translators are working remotely again, but if not, maybe we can just turn the sound up in the room, because otherwise you do have the echoing even listening to the same language.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. I've had the clerk check on that. I've been advised that it meets the standards and requirements for the House of Commons translation. So I'm told it's easier as I'm doing. I just take my earpiece away because it is a bit distracting, I agree, but it meets the approved standards. Madame, for 6 minutes.
For 6 minutes.
Today. And it was just released last week that the unemployment rate has jumped to 6.1% in March of 2024. So this was just as of last month, and it was 5.8% in February. And in addition, this 6.1% is a full percentage point up from a year ago. So what I'd like to ask you is this something that you're concerned with? And are you hearing from your members or workers on this? And I'd like to ask both witnesses this. So maybe we'll start with Mr. Greer first, and then.
Sure. The short answer is yes. In addition to the figures you referenced, a lot of the underlying economic growth figures are extremely concerning to our members and the communities in which they operate. For all of the reasons that you would assume, which is it creates a less favorable environment to hire, to scale up, to go after new market opportunities. It creates a more challenging environment to attract investment and creates issues for any business that's looking to expand. So, we've long been advocating for a more competitive economic environment in which our members can operate. And there are a range of tax, regulatory, trade, and other things that we believe are not only desirable but necessary to help generate the growth that can fund the social safety net that is important to all of our members, their families, and of course everyone around this table.
Thank you. And over to the Canadian Labour Congress.
Thank you so much for the question. And of course, we're very concerned about any rise in unemployment rates. And workers, quite frankly, want to ensure that they have good, stable employment. And good, stable employment means having a living wage in a community that they can afford to live in, with transit that they can afford to actually take to get to work. When those pieces are missing and when employment is precarious or part-time or casual, that is an impediment to actually taking on some of those roles when you have a lack of childcare, a lack of elder care in the community. So we are needing to look at all aspects of our society to determine how we can best support workers to be actually able to take on some of those jobs that you speak of.
Great, thank you very much. And just to add on to that, in contrast, we saw unemployment was in the United States actually dropped to 3.8% because of the strength of the U.S. economy. And so my question is, do you have a sense, based on your experience or what you're hearing, why more people in Canada are losing their jobs than the U.S.? And I'll the same question to both of you, so we'll start with Mr. Greer again.
Well, there are a number of reasons why there's such a disparity, but at the heart of it is the productivity difference between Canada and the U.S. and the significant productivity level increases in the U.S. that we haven't seen in Canada. Now, there are some structural reasons for that. You might think of the U.S. Military-industrial complex and the types of investments that help drive productivity through there, but there are also a bunch of underlying policy reasons around decisions made, again, tax, regulatory, and otherwise that drive investment, along with, if I may say, uncertainty. Certainly regulatory uncertainty, project uncertainty, and germane to this discussion, supply chain uncertainty. Customers, investors look at disputes like last year's dispute on the West Coast with BC Ports, and it leaves questions in their mind about investing in this market or buying from Canadian manufacturers.
And same question to you, Ms. Brusky.
And I would say that workers, again, want jobs that are steady and where they have the opportunity to progress. And that generally means working under a collective agreement that gives you a voice at work. And so we very much encourage working with employers at bargaining tables to set the table for long-term employment for those workers. Having access to a union card, having access to being able to sit down at a bargaining table to discuss the issues that are of matter at that particular workplace, to have regular wage increases, to have opportunities to advance at work, are critically important. And I think that it's a tripartite kind of situation that we need to take on, bringing employers, levels of government to the table to look at what those conditions of employment might be that would encourage full employment.
Thank you. My next question is, I wanted to dive a bit into the context of working class people who are trying to build their lives and or maybe trying to build towards retirement. And so it was just released that the average Canadian family must now pay 63.5% of their total pre-tax household income in order to afford a mortgage payment on the typical home in Canada. And it's even worse in British Columbia for any of your members or organizations that you represent, where it's 106%, which basically means more than someone's entire family income. So are these concerns that you're hearing from your members or workers? And I'll ask you both the same question, Mr. Greer.
Yes, they are. And again, it goes back, I think, to the previous answer around Canada's labor productivity. More productive labor markets means more job creation, lower unemployment, and higher earnings, all of which raises the quality of life for Canadian workers and their families. And so tackling the underlying issues that are driving Canada's low productivity, we believe, is a way to help reverse that trend in the figures that you've cited.
And Ms. Brusky?
Thank you for the question. Affordability is top of mind for all workers in Canada, regardless of where you go and who you speak with in any sector, I would say. Speaking with a classroom of students just last week, they cited that as their number one issue, and of course that's what we hear everywhere, right? But the second to that issue is the issue of housing, and of course that's tightly tied together. Workers are looking for all levels of government to come up with solutions to affordability issues, and that means coming up with investments to colleges and universities to lower tuition rates, for example. That means finding solutions to the housing crisis and finding a variety of different kinds of housing that speak to the variety of needs that Canadians have, whether they're first-time home buyers or whether they're elderly individuals looking to live in a co-op kind of environment, having investments in those kinds of things. It means things like a pharmacare system so they can actually afford their medication. And it means building our employment insurance system for it to be robust so that people can rely on those things.
Thank
That's
you,
what workers are
Madame
looking
Brusk and Ms. Gray. Mr. Sheehan for six minutes.
Very much to the presenters as well for your presentations. Lana Payne from the Unifor testified here and mentioned that strikes with replacement workers last longer than regular strikes. And one of the things that you had mentioned, and we're going to keep on the theme of affordability because you brought this up, you've walked the line, you've supported people in strike positions, and you mentioned that they make less pay. Like I think they call it strike pay. How does that work, and how is that challenging for a middle-class family. We heard about a grandmother that was trying to support her children and grandchildren at this committee. So could you please explain what strike pay is for the committee?
Absolutely. So certainly when a worker is out on strike or when there's a lockout, generally speaking, most unions will have a strike fund. How much worker gets paid while they're out on a strike will differ based on what their union can afford, quite frankly. And some unions might be able to almost make you whole, but that's very rare. But for the most part, you're taking a significant hit in your paycheck, less than 50% of what you would be making than if you were at work. So that is a calculated decision that workers have to make as to whether or not they can actually afford to go out on strike. We might think that that's an easy decision for workers to make. They're upset, they're angry, they want to take that strike action. That is not an easy decision. That is a very much something has to build up in front of that worker before they make that kind of a decision. And it's generally multiple rounds of bargaining that have led to this particular situation. It's often because the employer is looking to take something away, or there's a respect and dignity issue in their workplace, or there's a significant affordability issue. These things are not overnight decisions. These are difficult decisions.
So that creates a challenge then. So you have replacement workers being brought in. You have workers trying to support their families and themselves making significantly less amount of pay. So vis-a-vis, you could see why some folks would support using replacement workers when it's challenging workers. So I really appreciate you clarifying that for us. Now, one other thing I wanted to bring up was the previous government had brought in two pieces of legislation which, quite frankly, the union movement on all stripes had said it was the most anti-union legislation that we have seen in forever. And it was 377 and 525, I believe. Could you please explain to the committee what that was and why was it punitive?
So again, when workers decide to go on strike, it's after a lot of frustration that comes to the fore. And I will point out that in many situations where scabs are used, scabs are hired and paid more than the very workers that are out on strike. And that was certainly the case in my home province of Manitoba, where there was a Liquor Control Commission strike last year. The employees were making near minimum wage new hires, whereas scabs were hired at $20 an hour. So that is a further frustration that leads to a lot of anger on the picket line. Two very egregious pieces of legislation that you mentioned, C-525 and Bill C-377. C-377 was really designed to ensure that unions are tied up in knots with all kinds of regulation and reporting of their union finances, right, to outside agencies. Union leaders are democratically elected. Union members have the right to see their financial statements at any given point in time. Union members are elected to boards as trustees. They have regular access to their union statements. They know how their union is spending their money defending their interests. That was specific to tie unions up with a whole bunch of time, paperwork, and energy surrounding the ability to not be able to perform and to not be able to represent their members as well as possible. C-525 really was designed to limit the amount of unionization within the federal public sector. And we know that when you carry a union card in your back pocket, you have a greater chance to be part of Canada's middle class. And that's what we want for all workers, the ability to sit at a bargaining table, if you so choose, to be represented by a union to bargain a fair deal.
58 said to 377 and 525, pun intended. But I really appreciate that. And I'd like to go to Ryan right now. And Ryan, you'd mentioned about the different transportation networks that, you wanted to discuss and talk about. I'm also on the trade committee. And during the trade committee, the longshore people had mentioned that they kept using replacement workers and whatnot, and it was really hard to get, this is their testimony, to get the employer at the table. And quite frankly, they felt it prolonged what happened out west, and it shouldn't have. So would you not agree that, the best deals are done at the table, and that we ought to get people at the table consistently, not when, with this longshore men, because it was a man at the time, had said that they would have to, the union would present to the opposite, and they couldn't make decisions because they weren't the employer either. They were representatives. They'd have to go back. It was delaying things forever. Do you have any comments about that?
First, I would agree, and I think everyone at this table would that absolutely the best deals are reached at the bargaining table. And The challenge with negotiations such as that one, which, I have no inside knowledge or information of, but certainly heard conflicting accounts about the positions of both the Employers Association and the longshoremen themselves. But that strike should serve as a warning to us all about how we make decisions that impact the balance in Canada's collective bargaining system. We did a survey of our members during the strike and found that it was costing manufacturers an average of $207,000 a day. So I know we heard all the figures around $10, $11 billion of trade disrupted, but it was impacting our members to the tune of an average of $200,000 a day. So, we share, all of our members share an interest in resolving these disputes as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Sheehan. Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Ms. Chabot, for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Brusque. I just want to say that I can hear myself talking, but I'll continue. I hope that it doesn't cause a problem for you. Thank you, Mr. Gura. Thank you for being here. It's for this important bill. Before I became an MP, I was a union leader, and in Quebec, we already have anti-scab legislation since 1977. Here in Canada, 2024, it's high time for it to happen. In fact, the Bloc Québécois has brought forward 11 bills on this issue, but particularly what I want to acknowledge is the workers and the unionized workers who have fought for decades for fair treatment. Because when you are a worker in Quebec, under Quebec jurisdiction, then these provisions exist. But if you're a Quebec worker but under a federal jurisdiction, then it's a different system. And in fact, there is a glaring illustration of that in Quebec. The Quebec port, the longshore people are on lockout and have been for 18 months. And there are replacement workers in there, and nobody seems to be bothered by that. It's quite worrisome as regards the workers, their morale, the labor relations, and even questions of health and safety. One of your major affiliates, Ms. Brusque, came here, the FTQ, with Mr. Bolduc as a representative, and he said roughly the same thing that you said, which I have said before too. There's a difference between tabling or introducing a piece of legislation and getting it adopted. In your opinion, how can we act in order to speed up the process of adopting this bill? Are there any amendments on those sections that we can take action on? For example, the time period for entry into effect. Can you follow up on that?
Thank you so much for the question. And yes, we would urge a very quick adoption of this bill. This is something that Labor has been fighting for literally decades. And as you've pointed out, it exists in Quebec. It exists currently in British Columbia. It is being tabled in Manitoba, and it was even tabled in Nova Scotia. We think that this is absolutely an issue of equity and fairness and getting to the bargaining table with the view of getting a deal done versus one party also at the same time planning to utilize scabs to keep the workplace going instead of participating in a fair way at the bargaining table to actually get to a deal. So first and foremost, a quicker implementation period is what we are after. We believe that the Canada Industrial Relations Board is well suited to implement the aspects of this bill in a much quicker way. And so we would suggest that a much shorter timeline rather than 18 months is what we'd be looking for. We also believe that a scab is a scab is a scab. It doesn't matter what your title is, whether you're a contractor, whether you're working in another workplace location, whether you're a management person. If you are performing struck work, you are doing work of somebody who is walking a picket line. There should be a full ban on any type of labor for the workers that are out on strike, barring, of course, the essential services that the parties have agreed to ensure that, life nor limb is going to be harmed, that there's no health and safety issues, those types of things. Those are the two key items that we would want to table.
Est-ce que vous auriez à
Could you
proposer
say whether you have any other amendments to propose apart from the 18-month time period for royal sanction? Are there any articles in the bill? Certain unions have raised issues with us regarding certain sections so that an employer who wants to get organized by starting a lockout, just take a look before the notice of negotiation if they have some subcontractors set up and to do indirectly what they cannot do directly. Are there any situations like that that you have submitted to the government as an amendment?
Yes, so under Article 9.5, contract workers hired just before a strike should also be considered to be scabs because, yes, the employer has the ability to hire up prior to a labor dispute, prior to a lockout or a strike starting. We also think that under Article 6.1, under the essential services provision, the CIRB has 15 days, or the parties have 15 days to come to an agreement. The CIRB, after that, has 90 days to render a decision if there is no agreement reached. We think that that's a very long period of time, especially when the parties are hopefully in bargaining during that time. We think a 45-day window is a much more reasonable period of time to render a decision. And we think that the Industrial Relations Board should be well staffed in order to actually meet that kind of a deadline.
Monsieur Greer, récemment, est-ce que vous
Mr.
êtes
Greer, are you aware that recently a favorable decision came out for the Montreal port to the effect that the longshore people are not in a situation of essential services? A decision has just been made regarding the supply chains not being part of the essential services. And how would you approach amendments that you might propose for this legislation? Isn't that a weakening of the right to strike or lockout, in your opinion?
Yes, our members are aware of and very concerned about the potential for a strike at the Port of Montreal for all the reasons you would expect is it will impact their business, their employees, and the livelihoods of their families. In terms of the bill itself, some of the amendments that we've suggested are just to take into account the national economic interest, which, as I said, when you have labor action at some of these supply chain nodes, it impacts communities and families that are often hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from a situation that they have no control over whatsoever. And so that's why we've proposed what we're suggesting.
Merci. Monsieur Belarus for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Belarus, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses with us here in the committee to discuss this important bill. And my political party also contributed to, and I've been very concerned about it. And as was mentioned, there's an anti-strike legislation that was brought in 1977 in Quebec, brought in because men and women organized and defended their rights, and they worked in order to improve their working conditions and living conditions. At the federal level, we haven't gotten there yet, even if there are more and more provincial examples, and it's a good sign, but we're nearly there. I started working in the SCFP a long time ago, but then there was the Videotron work conflict that labor dispute that lasted for a year, and it was very long because there were replacement workers. And I think that was my first realization in my lifetime of the impact of not having this legislation in place. And I'm not talking only about things 20 years ago, but 2 years ago, Océan Maritime in Sorel was on the lockout, and the replacement workers were paid a higher wage by the employer than what the unionized workers were demanding, and who were on a lockout. So it's really anti-union tactics. And right now, the Quebec port, it's been more than a year and a half. The Videotron-Gatineau right now, just across the river, hundreds of workers are on lockout. And every day they see other people taking their work and taking their salary and taking their wages. According to your experience, Ms. Brusque, what is the impact on the lives of families and the spouses of these workers who see the bread being taken away from under their nose?
Absolutely. When you see a replacement worker, a scab, crossing your picket line to go to work, of course, that provides a significant amount of anger and frustration. And we know that where replacement workers are utilized, there's a significant division within the community. sometimes within families, especially in smaller community and in communities where there's one main employer and people work at that particular workplace location. And so we have seen violence on picket lines. We have seen incitement of workers, right? And incitement of scabs, quite frankly, as well as management crossing the picket lines. People are struggling to actually put groceries on the table while they're on strike because, again, these are not quick decisions as to whether or not you're going to walk a picket line. And to be demoralized by having your employer rub salt in that wound by not offering you a fair deal and then hiring a scab and often paying them more than what they are paying you right now to break that strike is incredibly demoralizing. It's been over 30 years since I was personally on a picket line. I can tell you every single person that walked that picket line with me, and I can tell you every single person that crossed that picket line. And that's well over 30 years ago.
Oui, ça marque malheureusement. Et
Yes, it leaves its mark, unfortunately. And we heard people say that the current bill would break the fragile balance at the bargaining table. But I'm a bit surprised, Ms. Brusque, because to me, at the federal level, in federal sectors, there is no balance. Right now, there's an imbalance because if the employer is able to use replacement workers, there's no incentive, either financially or with economic impact, because their business keeps going, the revenues keep coming in. So why would they return to the bargaining table and negotiate a work contract when to the government it's either the unionized workers or replacement workers, either way they keep on going.
plus, il peut avoir
There's
la
no
menace.
clout, and in some sectors there may be the threat of special legislation to return to work from the federal government. So I would like you to explain in actual fact how things go on, this lack of a clout when there's an imbalance with replacement workers.
So I've spent 10 years at bargaining tables in my work career at the private and public sector, in private and public sector workers in the province of Manitoba. And I can tell you that not every employer is going to use scabs, but those that do will indicate that pretty much on day one of bargaining, right? They will make that indication by the kinds of proposals that they table, by the attitude that they bring to the bargaining table about whether or not they are serious at looking at your proposals. They will be looking at very aggressive proposals towards what they're tabling, towards your committee, and they will be looking to incite that situation rather than coming to the table to actually collectively discuss the issues at hand in a meaningful way to find a fair and reasonable resolve. Whether there's a mediator involved or not doesn't much matter if an employer is not prepared to actually come and fairly bargain a collective agreement. Having the opportunity to continue to operate while there's a strike on is always going to be an imbalance, because that means that there is no need for that employer to come to the bargaining table with the actual intent of reaching that collective agreement.
Merci. Peut-être une dernière
Thank you,
question.
and perhaps one last question, because as was mentioned in your presentation and your answers, that the bill provides for exemptions for certain cases where human life is in danger, or people have to come to work because health and safety of the public is endangered, or it could have a catastrophic environmental impact. And I think that we all agree that it's reasonable, but I am hesitant about the issues of national interest or economic national interest. There are sometimes gray zones which can become a huge cornucopia that we can put everything in to reduce workers' rights.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this bill does provide for an opportunity for essential services agreements to take those things into consideration and to come up with a resolve that the parties can agree with before a labor dispute would start. Our issue is we want to make sure that the Canada Industrial Relations Board has a shorter turnaround window to get back to the parties in terms of what an essential service needs look like for that particular workplace, and then to let the parties continue on that bargaining process.
Monsieur Bullers.
Mr. Boulris, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. I actually want to take a bit of a different tack on this. I know that the Canadian Labour Congress has some affiliates in the construction business. And of course, we are in desperate need of more homes in this country. And we know that builders are already struggling to attract and retain skilled trades. In fact, the job vacancy rate in the construction sector in the third quarter of 2023 was 5.1%, which is among the highest across all Canadian industries. So I'm wondering if there's anything about this bill or in this bill that you think, Ms. Brusque, that might actually attract and help improve attracting more skilled trades into the industry to help us build the homes that we need.
I think think anytime that workers see that they have a job to go to and that they're not likely going to be out on a picket line for any length of time because their employer is going to come and bargain a fair collective agreement, that provides some comfort to knowing that you have a job to go to. We know that trades unions are very focused on making sure that that they are able to hire up into that trade stream so that we can meet the needs of builders, of communities as they're building these new houses, and we very much encourage that active participation. But we also know that those workers want to see a fair and free collective, free bargain collective agreement.
So would you make the same argument then that, you know, of course, there's a lot of in the sector, a lot of folks in the sector are aging out of the sector and they're not attracting young people into it. Do you think that, you know, over the next 10 years, this is the same kind of argument that will help attract young people into the industry?
I think what's going to help attract people into the industry is, first of all, understanding that these are good jobs, that these are good family and community sustaining jobs. I think attracting newcomers to Canada, attracting women, attracting racialized workers into that industry is going to be incredibly important. And that's an opportunity for unions to sit down with employers to find out what those challenges are to actually bringing folks to that particular industry. Things like childcare. I know lots of women want to work in trades, but if you don't have childcare at 7 in the morning when your shift starts, you're not going to be able to work in that particular field. So there are many things that need to actually be addressed, and I know that trades unions are on these issues. They're very much focused on finding solutions, and we're going to be working with them to be able to achieve that goal.
Okay, thanks. I do want to thank you for being here. There are some emerging issues, and I need to raise this now, unfortunately, and I apologize for having to do this, but this is an issue that's come up, and so I actually have a motion, Mr. Chair, that I'd like to move. And if you'd like me to read it.
The floor is yours, Mr. Aitchison.
The motion reads as such. Trudeau is recycling the same costly promises that have already doubled housing costs in the last 8 years. He's doubled the rent, doubled mortgage payments, and doubled the needed down payment for an average home. Housing costs have worsened more in Canada than any other G7 country in the past 8 years. According to a recent report from RBC, housing became more unaffordable in every single market tracked, including Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, Montreal, Halifax, and more, with some markets reaching all-time unaffordability levels. The average Canadian family must now pay 63.5% of their total pre-tax household income in order to afford mortgage payments on a typical home in Canada. Therefore, the committee report its concern regarding this matter to the House of Commons, and A, invite the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities to appear before committee for no less than 2 hours by April the 18th, 2024, and B, invite RBC Assistant Chief Economist Robert Hogue to testify before the committee for no less than 2 hours by April the 18th, 2024.
Thank you, Mr. Aitchison. Yes, the clerk has advised me the motion is in order. It has 48 hours notice to the committee members. This is a processing committee. The member has moved a motion in his time, which now we must discuss that motion until we dispose of it. Discussion, I have Mr. Fragas-Catos and then Ms. Gray. Mr. Fragas-Catos on the motion of Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, here we are discussing very important, arguably historic legislation that is before this committee. Legislation that shows what's possible when parties collaborate towards a common goal, and that is to support workers across this country. If anything needed to be exposed by about the conservative discourse recently, that whole messaging around workers and how the party of workers, they say, it's been exposed today. Why put this motion forward when we're discussing such an important issue at the committee with respect to the legislation? Regardless, housing is a critical issue, and so we're glad to take up the motion that's been introduced here. What I would propose is the following amendment, and that's been circulated to the clerk already. The first paragraph would be dropped. It would begin, according to a recent report, so on and so forth, ending at the word levels. It would continue, the average Canadian family must now pay 63.5% of their pre-tax household income in order to afford mortgage payments on a typical home in Canada. That would conclude the second paragraph. Finally, therefore, the committee invite the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, RBC Assistant Chief Economist Robert Hogue, to testify before the committee on the study of homelessness and affordable housing adopted on February 12th, 2024. I'll remind you, Chair, and I'll remind colleagues that that particular motion opened the door to a housing study that will be taking place at the beginning of June, if my memory serves. I think we've agreed to at subcommittee on an existing agenda. These issues are important, but so are the other issues that are before the committee. And so I think that we're acting in good faith here to have the witnesses that the Conservatives want to come before committee to come at the appropriate time when we take up the housing study. And it will be an important housing study. I look forward to it very much, to explore the various ideas that each of the parties has on housing and to see how this committee can make a constructive contribution towards the entire issue of housing in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Kados. An amendment has been moved to the motion, and it is admissible. Madam Clerk? We have it. Does the committee, the clerk will take a minute or so to have it circulated, but the amendment is in order. It was moved, so we can suspend for a moment. Well, yeah, because we do have two more, and they will be speaking to the amendment. So in order to be fair, everybody needs to have the amendment. As soon as the clerk advises me, we will, Ms. Gray and Ms. Ferrari will speak on the amendment of Mr. Fragos-Catos, which is in order. And then Mr. Belarus. Remind the witnesses that this is a procedure within committee, and we had a motion that was introduced, and it must be dealt with. So, advise me we need a few more seconds. Must only occur on the amendment that has been moved. Get the clerk to speak to that. Madam Clerk?
Members, so I just sent by email an email with the Word document, and inside the Word document, I indicated in track change what Mr. Fragos-Catos' amendment is. And so if you accept the track change, that would be the motion, including his amendment.
Okay, so everybody now has the amendment moved by Mr. Fragos-Catos, so we'll go to Ms. Gray. Ms. Gray on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You had mentioned a brief suspension, and I think that would be appropriate because we literally just got it. So I'd like to actually read it. There's quite a lot of changes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I will entertain that. I will suspend. I will I will suspend for 2 moments. This still allows us to get back before our first hour. So suspend for 2 minutes. Okay, committee members, the committee will resume, and I understand there may be a minor difference in the translation, which Mr. Boulous will speak to, but I'm going to return to Ms. Gray Ms. Ferrari, and then Monsieur Bolarus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be really brief, just so that we can move on here. I mean, the Liberals have basically gutted the entire motion, and what they've said is that we will deal with this when we're working on this greater study, which doesn't happen till June. So here they're saying that we're not going to talk about housing till June, and yet there's all of these new emerging numbers that are coming out that are reiterating what kind of a housing crisis we're having. So, I mean, for that, they've basically removed everything that's being requested. So I can't support it based on what they've done.
Thank you. Ms. Ferrari on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. Just to the motion that was put forward to study the housing and then the amendment that was put forward by the Liberal member. To his point, because we do have witnesses here and we are studying a very important bill, and these witnesses who represent the majority of workers across Canada have told us very strongly today that housing is the biggest issue for a lot of these workers. This is, you can't go move, you can't get rent if you don't have a job, you can't get a job if you don't have a house. And so we know that these stats are staggering, and in particular, it was the toughest time ever, according to RBC report, to afford a home in Canada, based on ownership costs as a proportion of median household. So the motion put forward by my colleague was to study this, to report the matter to the House of Commons so that we can get to the bottom of this, because the average Canadian family must now pay 63.5% of their total pre-tax household income. But the amendment put forward has removed the piece to report this to the House of Commons, which is where it would be debated, where you would actually get policy and legislation in place. So again, there's nothing here, so I can't support this amendment.
Thank you. Monsieur Bolarus, sur l'amendement.
Mr.
merci.
Boulris to the amendment. Yes, thank you, Chair. Of course, I will support the amendment that was put forward by the representative of the government, because the original version of the motion is in fact a dilatory tactic to delay the discussion and the adoption of the anti-SCAB legislation, whereas we had already planned on a study on the important issue of housing in June. And I think it's reasonable, in view of what the witnesses told us here today and in the previous meeting, we have to work diligently, and with the dates presented in the Conservative motion, it delays the process for the studying of C-58, which for the NDP is not acceptable. But I would like nevertheless to propose a sub-amendment, Chair, because in the Liberal amendment that was presented to us, the difference between the English and French versions, in the French version, it invites the Governor of the Bank of Canada. In the English version, the Governor of the Bank of Canada is not invited. He is simply left out. So I would like to propose a friendly amendment so that the two versions be the same and that the Governor of the Bank of Canada be invited. Thank you, sir.
Any discussion on the sub-amendment of Mr. Bolarus? Seeing none, I'm going to call a vote if it's required on the sub-amendment. Well, I'll call a vote on the sub-amendment of Mr. Bolarus. Recorded vote.
Mr. Fragiscatos?
Yes.
Mr. Long?
Yes.
Mr. Collins? Mr. Coteau? Mr. Sheehan? Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mrs. Falk? Ms. Ferrari?
Yes.
Mr. Aitchison?
Yes.
Madame Chabot?
Oui.
Monsieur Boulris? Yes pour
The
11.
sub-amendment has been carried unanimously. We'll now go back to the amendment as amended. Did you want the floor, Mr. Bolarus? Seeing no discussion, I will call a recorded vote on the amendment as amended.
Mr. Fragiscatos?
Yes.
Mr. Long?
Yes.
Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Mr. Coteau?
Yes.
Mr. Sheehan? Mrs. Gray?
No.
Mrs. Falk? Ms. Ferrari?
No.
Mr. Aitchison?
No.
Madame Chabot?
Oui.
Monsieur Boulris?
The amendment as amended has been carried. I will now call a vote on the amendment, on the motion as amended. Madam Clerk, record a vote.
Mr. Fragiscatos?
Yes.
Mr. Long?
Yes.
Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Mr. Coteau?
Yes.
Mr. Sheehan?
Oui.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mrs. Falk? Ms. Ferrari?
Yes.
Mr. Aitchison? Madame Chabot?
Oui.
Monsieur Boulris?
Oui.
Amendment is, the motion is carried unanimously as amended. For the benefit of the witnesses, I'm going to conclude the second round, which is 5 minutes to Mr. Collins, then Madame Chabot and Mr. Billerus, which will carry us into committee business. Mr.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr. Aitchison still had time because he moved a motion.
Yes, but we've went through this before. When you call a motion in your time, the clock runs until it expires. If you conclude it before we go back to him. He had 2.5 minutes left, and he's 5-minute time when he called the motion, and we've used about 15 minutes of that. So we've already reviewed that, and I made my decision on that. Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes. Mr. Collins?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Ms. Brusk, coming from Hamilton, there are some legendary conflicts that have occurred in the past in terms of the use of replacement workers, scab workers. United Steelworkers, I know back in the 40s, there's books have been written about that in their fight for a 40-hour work week. Stelco used replacement workers, and I think to your point in terms of decades later now, people still remember those stories and that fight. And it created a very adversarial relationship even beyond after the 81, I can't remember the exact days, after the 80-day strike was over, the conflict and the relationship between the employer and the employees and the union was soured for decades. Can you talk about the impact that the use of scab workers has on the workplace after conflicts are settled, whether they're short, medium, or long-term disruptions?
Absolutely. Walking into a workplace when there's been a labor dispute, when you've had to walk a picket line, especially when scabs have been utilized to literally take food out of your children's mouths, is not something that workers forget or that they will ever get beyond. And so the situation and the atmosphere within a workplace, it becomes extremely challenging. There is going to be ongoing distrust, ongoing animosity, and it makes every round of bargaining thereafter that much more difficult. So in order to actually reach a good collective agreement, there has to be a bit of a relationship of trust. That doesn't mean you have to agree with each other, but you have to be able to be in the same room to explore what the issues are, to really understand, where the other party is coming from and what are the issues that you're seeking to find a solution to. The best opportunity that you have is to actually have that relationship of trust to be able to deal with difficult issues. And workers need to feel that they have dignity in the conversations in order to actually put forward what the issue at hand is for them. When there is that kind of a dispute where you are basically discarded and disposable, you're not going to feel any kind of empathy towards that employer, and you're not going to have that trust to be able to actually express what the concerns are. And so these are decades-long situations where it's going to be a rebuilding that has to take place, and it needs often a change in management in order to actually rebuild that kind of a relationship.
Thank you for that answer. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has sent correspondence to the committee talking about the impacts that the legislation will have on the daily lives of Canadians if, in fact, it's passed. It talked about disruption in telecommunication services, our ability to travel when there may be a strike or a lockout. And they talk about the impact on the economy, and maybe there'll be some hesitancy in terms of investors looking at Canada as a place to invest. Can you talk about those comments and whether you see them as valid or not?
I think there's a little bit of fear-mongering in those comments. At the end of the day, what we want is for employers to come to the table with a clear view of reaching a collective agreement. 95% of collective agreements are signed without a labor dispute, without any kind of a disruption, without any kind of stoppage. And in those cases where there is a dispute or there is a stoppage, it's a smaller number where scabs are actually in use. What we are trying to deal with here is those egregious examples where employers have zero intent of actually reaching a collective agreement. And what I'm most concerned about is the economic reality for those workers who are having to walk that picket line.
1.5 minutes left. Well, I guess my last question would be related to when the legislation passes, there'll be provinces that look at this and they'll undertake studies in the future at committees just like the one we're sitting on today. And they'll talk about British Columbia and Quebec and the impact the legislation has had there. We'll implement this and we'll see the benefits and gains that will accrue to unions and their members. How will this help other provinces and territories who may look at this legislation in the future and say, you know what, we should be going down the same path provincially in our respective province?
I think this legislation simply modernizes labor relations in Canada. And so it's beyond time that we actually get to this particular piece of legislation. This is something we should have had for many decades. We see that the sun still rises in Quebec and the sun still rises in BC with this legislation. So this is not egregious. This is actually resetting the balance at the bargaining table to help the parties get to a fair collective agreement.
Thanks for that.
Mr. Collins, good. We got 30 seconds. Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et demi.
For 2.5 minutes, Ms. Chabot. Thank you. Ms. Brusque, it was also raised that this bill does not aim to exclude public service employees. Would you be in agreement that the bill as presented applies to federal public service employees?
I would absolutely be in agreement that this bill ought to be expanded to include all public service workers. We think that that's an oversight, and we think that all employees should have the protection of this bill.
There's something I'd like us to discuss because an anti-scab bill is not to generate conflicts. It's really the opposite. And sometimes we hear people say that there are going to be more and more conflicts that are going to last longer and be more negative. So there's something in the equation that's been left out that you've already cited. Replacing strikers is an obstacle to harmonious labor relations, which can constitute a violation of the right to strike, which is now recognized by the Charter or by the Constitution. So could you tell us in what way that would contribute to harmonious relations and not the reverse?
Absolutely. I mean, the right to strike we see as being covered under as a charter right, and we believe that the right to strike really is the right to reach a fair collective agreement. Again, as I noted right off the top, no worker goes to a bargaining table and says, I want to go on strike because I think it would be nice to have a break from work. Nobody says that. The reality is what people want is a fair deal so that they can feed and house their families, so that they can have a good workplace relationship with their employers, so that they can address the issues that are at play within their workplace, whether they're health and safety, respect and dignity, hours of work issues, training, those kinds of issues. This legislation forces both parties to be very thoughtful about their approach at the bargaining table. It forces the parties to actually want to reach and conclude a collective agreement and to deal with the issues at hand and to take the opportunity to have in-depth, longer conversations rather than just saying a glib no or a glib we actually need this and, you know, we're pushing this agenda through. So the right to strike, the right to collective bargaining, the right to representation as a charter right is critically important to us. And this is simply modernizing what needs to happen in labor relations in Canada.
Madame Chabot, Monsieur Belarus pour 2 minutes et...
Thank you, Ms. Chabot. Mr. Boulouris, 2.5 minutes to conclude. Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Brusque, you talked about the 90-day time period that you find a bit too long and that you would like to see reduced to 45 days. In our previous discussions, a lot was said about the resources of Canadian Industrial Relations Board, their financial resources, the ability to train, capacity to train and all that. That is not in the bill, but it has an impact in real life, like the possibility to go and check whether or not there are some secret replacement workers being used or have inspectors out in the field and investigations. To what extent is it important for the board to have those resources?
I have a great amount of respect for the Canada Industrial Relations Board, for the chair and for all of the workers there that really work very hard to ensure that workers and employers get fair treatment when it comes to issues of dispute amongst, you know, whatever the issue of the day might be. We need to make sure that that board is properly resourced. that training and recruitment can happen, that we have long-term staff that are very well trained and have years of experience. These are difficult and challenging situations to try to intervene as a mediator or as a conciliation officer in a dispute. So you need to have the respect and the trust of the parties. It means a decades-long ability to understand the nuances that happen at the bargaining table and where the pressure is coming from both the employer and for the employee group, and being able to actually provide that assistance to those groups. So making sure that we have the resources at the Canada Industrial Relations Board is critically important so that they can do that hard work that we are all, as a society, relying on.
Merci beaucoup. Tout à fait d'accord, évidemment, avec ça, mais je voulais...
Thank you very much, and of course I agree with that, but I'd like us to emphasize that aspect. You talked about the 18-month time period for implementation. It's spring 2024. It's going to go back to the House for the third reading, and then the Senate. We're in a minority government. We don't know when the next federal election will take place. You talked about reducing that 18-month time period. What would be the impact of keeping such a long time period of 18 months?
Again, the impact of that is that there's more chance of ongoing strikes that may happen in that 18-month period of time. We want to get to a point where there's more of an impetus for parties to actually gain a collective agreement that's being struck at the bargaining table. And we think 18 months, quite frankly, is far too long. So we're looking for a much shorter window of time. That means the CIRB needs to be properly resourced with the needs, have their needs met in order to deal with the essential services component of it, in order to give decisions in a more timely manner, and to make sure that they're staffing up in anticipation of this particular bill being passed.
Merci, Mr. Boulris.
Thank you, Mr. Boulris.
To thank the witnesses for attending and addressing the questions from the committee members. We'll suspend for a few moments because we must go in camera to resume committee business. So again, to the witnesses, thank you for your attendance. We'll suspend for 3 minutes. Suspend.